Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction and such a lengthy introduction. I don't know whether I can quite live up to it. And thank you, of course, for inviting me and for organizing the visit. It was not very long ago that Anglophone scholars of racism understood it in terms of biology and specifically in terms of the black-white binary. At the same time, other scholars, especially in continental Europe, understood racism in terms of anti-Semitism, especially in the recent biologized forms that Europe has manifested. When it began to be clear that these two paradigms were failing to capture some contemporary experiences, such as anti-Asian cultural racism, and of course you'll all be aware that by Asian, in Britain especially, but now also in Europe, we mean people of South Asian origin, not like in the US you mean people of East Asian origin. So it was failing to capture some contemporary experiences, such as anti-Asian cultural racism in Britain or anti-Arab cultural racism in France. Some scholars began to move away from these two paradigms. Yet following the assertive Muslim agency triggered off by the Satanic Verses affair and other Muslim controversies, as Muslims responded to such hostilities and articulated their misrecognition, they were constantly told, especially in Britain, that there's no such thing as anti-Muslim racism, because Muslims are a religious group and not a race. Hence, Muslims could legitimately ask for toleration and religious pluralism, but not for inclusion in anti-racist egalitarian analyses and initiatives. While this view continues to be expressed even today, and some deny that there is a racism that could be labeled Islamophobia, it no longer has the hegemony it once was. The origins of the term Islamophobia have been variously traced to an essay by two French Orientalists in the early part of the 20th century, or to a neologism of the 1970s, that's another scholar's view, to an early 1990s American periodical, that's another person's view, and indeed even to an article of mine. Two scholars have said that the earliest use of Islamophobia that they could find in print were to two articles of mine in 1991. But I know they're wrong, because I know I didn't invent the term. And in fact, other scholars now have shown that they are wrong. I think mine's about the fifth or the sixth use of it in print. What is less disputed is that the term received its public policy prominence with the Runnymede Trust's Commission on British Muslims and Islamophobia in 1997, with their report, which was called Islamophobia, A Challenge for Us All, which defined it as, I quote, an unfounded hostility towards Islam and therefore fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. While a number of Anglophone authors, including myself, started using the concept of Islamophobia in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was this 1997 Runnymede Trust report which launched the career of the term as a concept of public discourse in Britain and much beyond. While the report was groundbreaking and played a crucial role in getting people to think about anti-Muslim prejudice, I felt it did not sufficiently locate Islamophobia as a racism like, say, anti-Semitism. I continued to write about Islamophobia as a form of cultural racism, which may be built on racism based on physical appearance, such as, say, color racism, but was a form of racism in its own right. Again, like anti-Semitism. This also became the approach of UNESCO, and I'm pleased to say that it has been explicitly embraced by the new 2017 Runnymede Trust report entitled Islamophobia, Still a Challenge for Us All. In this talk, I want to argue three propositions. These three. Firstly, that Islamophobia is a form of othering or cultural racism, amongst other things. Secondly, that critique of othering. Now, I could have just written critique of Islamophobia, but I think because Islamophobia is a form of othering, I'll generalize it and say critique of othering presupposes non-othered knowledge of the other, which is a little bit of a mouthful, and you might think, what does that mean? But I hope by the time I've finished, I've made myself a bit clearer. And thirdly, critique of othering presupposes a normative framework which needs to be justified. So I'll start with the first. Islamophobia is a form of othering or cultural racism. Islamophobia is a form of cultural racism because while the perception and treatment of Muslims clearly has a religious and cultural dimension, it equally clearly bears a phenotypical component. For while it is true that Muslim is not a biological category in the way that, say, Black or possibly even South Asian or Chinese is, neither was Jew. In that instance, it took a long non-linear history of racialization to turn an ethno-religious group, the Jewish people, into a race. More precisely, the latter did not so much as replace the former, but superimposed itself, because even though no one denied that Jews were a religious community with a distinctive language or languages, culture or cultures, and a religion, Jews still came to be seen as a race and with horrific consequences. Similarly, Bosnian Muslims were ethnically cleansed because they came to be identified as a racial group by people who were phenotypically, linguistically, and culturally the same as themselves. The ethnic cleanser, unlike an inquisitor, wasted no time in finding out what people believed, if and how often they went to a mosque, and so on. Their victims were racially identified as Muslims. Race, then, as I understand it, is not just about biology or even color, for while racialization has to pick on some features of a people related to physical appearance and ancestry, because otherwise racism cannot be distinguished from other forms of groupism, if you like, even from, say, class. So, physical appearance and ancestry are necessary features in the identification of a race. These items, physical appearance and in particular physical appearance, need only be a marker and not necessarily denote a form of determinism. This is illustrated in the conceptualization of cultural racism as what I call a two-step process. While biological racism is the antipathy, exclusion, and unequal treatment of people on the basis of their physical appearance or other imputed physical differences, saliently in Britain, their non-whiteness, cultural racism, so other physical differences like their non-whiteness, cultural racism builds on biological racism a further discourse which evokes cultural differences from an alleged British or European or Western civilized norm to vilify, marginalize, or demand cultural assimilation from groups who also suffer from biological racism. Post-war racism in Britain, and I would say Western Europe, has been simultaneously culturalist and biological. And while the latter is essential to the racism in question, It is, in fact, the less explanatory aspect of a complex phenomenon. Biological interpretations have not governed what white British people, including racists, have thought or done. How they've stereotyped, treated, and related to non-whites. And biological ideas have had increasingly less force, both in the context of personal relationships and in the conceptualization of groups. As white people's interactions with non-white individuals increased, they did not become necessarily less conscious of group differences, but they were far more likely to ascribe group differences to upbringing, customs, forms of socialization, and self-identity than to biological heredity. The interesting question arises as to whether it could be a one-step racism. Could color racism decline and fade away, and yet cultural racism remain and perhaps even grow? I just leave that as an interesting question. I'm not going to try and answer it. While this is an interesting question, it appears to go against what we should expect from communities and social dynamics, since cultures and cultural practices are usually internally diverse, containing and omitting various authentic elements and adaptations and mixes. It follows then that the culturalized targeting could very easily be expansive rather than purist, and so in one way or another catch most, if not all, cultural minorities in that group. Let me explain what I mean by expansive rather than purist. For example, a non-religious Muslim might still be targeted as a cultural Muslim or a Muslim by community, which means Muslim by background, which means birth and ancestry. Moreover, if we accept that racism does not necessarily involve attributing qualities which inhere in a deterministic law-like way in all members of a group, then we do not have to rule out cultural racism as an example of racism. I'm kind of assuming that most people will agree that even within a racist mentality, a racist doesn't have to believe in a law-like deterministic quality. But you know, if you have a different understanding of racism, then perhaps my example doesn't work. So what I'm saying then is that this means that cultural racism is not merely a proxy for racism. I hope you don't see this as a kind of logic chopping point or a small point, because I think it's actually quite significant, because most people who've written about cultural racism, Paul Gilroy, John Solomos and so on, their argument is that cultural racism is a proxy for real racism. My argument is the opposite. I'm saying cultural racism is a form of real racism. While racism involves some reference to physical appearance or ancestry, it does not require any form of biological determinism, only a physical identification on a group basis attributable to descent. As such, we should guard against the characterization of racism as a form of inherentism or biological determinism, which leaves little space to conceive the ways in which cultural racism draws upon physical appearance as one marker among others. Certainly, formulations of racialization should not be solely premised upon conceptions of biology in a way that ignores religion, culture, and the like. While understanding some contemporary treatment of Muslims and aspects of their societal status in terms of racialization clearly is an advance, we should beware that the conceptualization of Muslims in the West is not reduced to racialization or any other othering theoretical frame, such as Orientalism, Edward Said's Orientalism. By definition, othering sees a minority in terms of how a dominant group negatively and stereotypically imagines that minority as something other, as inferior or threatening and to be excluded. Indeed, the dominant group typically projects its own fears and anxieties onto the minority. Minorities, however, so this is really now the point I'm trying to make, minorities, however, are never merely projections of dominant groups, but have their own subjectivity and agency through which they challenge how they are perceived, or more to the point, misperceived, and seek to not be defined by others, but to supplant negative and exclusionary stereotypes with positive and prideful identities. Oppressive misrecognitions thus sociologically imply and politically demand recognition. Our analyses, therefore, should be framed in terms of a struggle for recognition. So obviously that's the kind of key point of the talk. The danger of reducing Muslims to racialized identities is particularly high at the moment because the Islamophobic othering of Muslims is acute and, if anything, rising. This can be seen in how aggressive negative portrayals of Muslims is standard in so much right-wing nationalism, whether in President Trump's Muslim bans, Marine Le Pen's Front National, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, or in various parties in Central and Eastern Europe, including the Freedom Party in Austria, which has now entered government. Discourses about Muslims are central to the internal debates in UKIP, that's the party that's got us Brexit, are central to the internal debates in UKIP about whether to become a working class party of welfarism or one defending our way of life against the alleged threats of Islamization. Western media routinely present Muslims as un-British, un-French, un-German, and so on, with a degree of hostility that no other group in Europe suffers, except perhaps the Roma in parts of Central Europe. It is therefore right that scholarly and public attention should be focused on this racialization of Muslim that is creating a deep, long-term division in our societies, which may be very difficult to reverse. Yet, like all ethnic or religious groups, Muslims are not merely created by their oppressors, but have their own sense of identity too. Multicultural inclusivity means recognizing and respecting these identities. Recognition, of course, does not mean thinking of Muslims as a group with uniform attributes or a single mindset, all having the same view on religion, personal morality, politics, the international world order, and so on. In this respect, Muslims are just like any other group. They cannot be understood in terms of a single essence, in terms of a single set of group attributes. Now, my view is that no one in the social sciences thinks that identities are based on cognitive or behavioral properties. If you think I'm wrong about this, I'd be quite interested to know, because I'm making this generalization. Perhaps it's not true. So here's my generalization. No one in the social sciences thinks, perhaps I should say anymore thinks, that identities are based on cognitive or behavioral properties that are shared by all who may be members of a relevant group, such as women, black people, gay and lesbians, and so on. If group members do not share a common essence, then they cannot be simply demarcated from non-group members, because there'll be many cases where individuals are not simply on one side of the boundary or the other. So groups cannot have discrete nor indeed fixed boundaries, as these boundaries may vary across time and place, across social context, and will be the subject of social construction and social change. So what I've just described, I think, is regularly called anti-essentialism, and that's what I'll call it in this talk. This anti-essentialism is rightly deployed in the study of Islamophobia and Muslims. It is a powerful way of handling ascriptive discourses, of showing that various popular or dominant ideas about Muslims, just as in the case of women, gays, and so on, are not true as such, but are aspects of socially constructed images that have been made to stick onto those groups of people because the ascribers are more powerful than the ascribed. Anti-essentialism is an intellectually compelling idea and a powerful resource in the cause of equality. And so the generalization that I said, I wonder if any of you might disagree with, is that we're all anti-essentialists in social sciences. I don't know of anyone who says they're not. Anyway, let's put it that way. But it is also common for authors to accuse each other of essentialism. I've certainly been accused of being an essentialist. This is because there are different versions of anti-essentialism. Anti-essentialism, however, can be variously interpreted. To pave the way for my second and third propositions, I want to briefly rehearse two interpretations which I discussed in my book, Multiculturalism, A Civic Idea, because I think that then helps us to understand my other two propositions. So, two interpretations of anti-essentialism. The first is the skeptical, what I call the skeptical interpretation that the critique, the anti-essentialist critique, kills the groups as real entities and they only live on as ascriptions or reactions to ascriptions or political make-believe. Rogers Brubaker, for example, argues that, I quote, ethnicity, race, and nation are not things in the world, but perspectives on the world. Part of the problem with his position is he doesn't say what a thing in the world is, so we don't know what it is that they're not. But anyway, he tells us what he thinks they are. They are perspectives on the world, ways of seeing, interpreting, and representing the social world. End of quote. One way to interpret this claim might be to conclude that there's something false, fictitious, and illegitimate about appeals to culture, ethnicity, and so on in understanding oneself, let alone others or society. Stuart Hall's words sometimes lend themselves to this radical conclusion. I quote, "If we feel we have a unified identity, it is only because we construct a comforting story or narrative of the self about ourselves. The fully unified, completed, secure, and coherent identity is a fantasy." So that's interpretation one of anti-essentialism. Skeptics do not necessarily want to kill off worthwhile political projects around, say, a black identity or feminism. And so some allow for something called strategic essentialism, as I'm sure you're all familiar. People like Spivak and Kristeva, where pretending that there's a black or national identity is permitted because of the politics, but analysts know that these identities are only, to use Hall's words, necessary fictions. I think, however, so I'm now moving towards what I think is the correct interpretation of anti-essentialism. I think, however, groups are not just strategically, but conceptually necessary to both social science and to anti-racism or egalitarian politics. And so I offered an alternative interpretation of anti-essentialism. I suggested that Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance offers a way of recognizing that just as it does not make sense to say that games or languages do not exist because they do not share a common definitional essence, so the lack of group essences and discrete bounded populations with unchanging characteristics was not a good reason to assert in an a priori way that groups did not exist. Rather, we had to have a more flexible, looser, and variable notion of group. So rather than denying that groups don't exist, we need to rethink what do we mean by groups. You know, if you like, we need to rethink in what way do groups exist. So we need a more flexible, looser, and variable notion of a group and of group membership that allowed for open-textured and overlapping boundaries and overlapping memberships. If it seems difficult to reconcile this with our a priori concept of group, let us call the entities groupings, or we can, we just call them something else. But really, we are talking about groups, in my opinion. The key point that I was making in my book, and I'm just very briefly summarizing here, the key point was that once we stopped demanding that groups measure up to our impossible definitions, we would lose the temptation to conclude, as Brubaker concludes and Hall concludes, we'd lose the temptation to conclude that groups suffered from an ontological deficiency, that they were merely perspectives upon the world, ontologically no superior to the products of othering. Another way of putting it is that just as the complete self-made individual of some liberal theories does not exist, it does not follow that individuals do not exist, that we have to give up individual from social science vocabularies. So similarly with groups. So that's my first proposition. In a way, I've gone beyond the first proposition to also then say something about how, as it were, Muslims can exist as a group. And we can think of Muslims as a group even while denying that Muslims are not a race. But on the other hand, I want to argue, of course, that Muslims are being racialized. So they're being racialized, but they're not a race, but nor are they merely a perspective upon the world. They actually do exist in the world. So the second proposition then, critique of othering presupposes non-othered knowledge of the other. And I'm going to be shorter on this, for the sake of time. The value of othering as a way of studying minorities is that it can be used to challenge blanket generalizations about a minority, as I've already said. Othering sometimes takes the form of attributing certain features to a group which are alleged to be found in all members of the group. For example, all blacks are muggers, all Muslims are fanatics, and so on. Theorists of racialization typically add that even when no explicit biological ideology is in play, these generalizations are being asserted by the racists in a quasi-naturalistic way. That is to say that, like the laws of nature, they brook no exceptions. The problem with this is that it's an implausible analysis of racialized thinking. Racists often do admit of counterexamples. My best friend is black and no mugger, and if only all blacks could be like that, but alas, they're not. Moreover, these racialized statements, which identify groups on the basis of their physical appearance, are not necessarily seeking biological or natural bases for racialized generalizations. The racializer is unlikely to believe that black mugging and Muslim fanaticism is genetic, and much more likely to think that it is something to do with upbringing, family structure, community norms, etc. In short, what we might call culture, in the manner of cultural racism that I've already described. Yes, the concept of othering has the power to point out to racists that their generalizations do not hold of every member of the putative race, that their thinking suffers from quasi-naturalism or essentializes a group. However, all the racist has to do to escape the critique is to say that they're not talking about all members, but some members, or many members, or most members, or more precisely, of more members than is true for other groups or society as a whole. So to make effective the anti-racist critique, one needs to engage with probabilistic statements. And that means relating it to what is known or can be researched empirically about the population in question. More fundamentally, the question that my discussion here raises is, when a dominant group attributes certain characteristics to a subordinate group, how do we work out which of those characteristics that are meant to constitute the otherness of the minority is an imagined and malign projection onto the minority, and which is a genuine feature of cultural difference? Assuming we don't want to deny the fact of cultural difference. Another way of putting this is that the analysis of othering is not a self-sufficient intellectual perspective or disciplinary inquiry. This is perhaps, you might think, overstating it, but we could discuss that. So I'm saying that the analysis of othering is not a self-sufficient intellectual perspective or disciplinary inquiry. For example, as in what one might call Orientalism or anti-racism studies. It is dependent on an inquiry into the groups as such, and not just in its othering. If we knew nothing about Muslims, we would have no way of knowing when they were being othered. And I do have more in this section, but I said I was going to be very brief. So what I'll do is just give you... I'll just read a little bit, yes. So the question is, because you might think I kind of ended in a rather aphoristic way just now. So do you understand the point I'm making when I say, if we knew nothing about Muslims, we'd have no way of knowing when they were being othered? Now, if that's true, it means we can't have an inquiry which is only about othering, because how would we know we were studying othering? Okay, good. Well, that's great. So the question is, can the kinds of minority groups I'm interested in be given any character, be the subject of any probabilistic generalization, which is not reducible to, is relatively independent of othering? The groups I'm interested in clearly have some kind of ethnic character, not necessarily in a pure or singular form, but perhaps as or including the ethno-racial, ethno-cultural, ethno-religious, and so on. By ethnicity here, I mean a group that is very likely to be subject to othering, yet which has an existence of its own, and not just as the imagined other of someone else. Namely that, in relation to a group defined by descent, there is an element of self-identification, and with it, community norms and structures, and the intersubjectivity that constitutes a group or groupness. The question then becomes, can this ethnicity be given any content? In my book, Multicultural Politics, which is quite a number of years ago, I gave an illustration, 5 dimensions of ethnic difference that cannot be reduced to othering or to external explanations. And that's the bit I'm going to read out. But you might say, well, it's still a bit too vague what I might mean by ethnicity? What is it that we could have generalizations about? What could there be an empirical inquiry about that's distinctive to mark out a group? So what I'll do is I'll just kind of flash what I'm not going to read out, not going to discuss. So I said I gave it 5 dimensions. I mean things like this: cultural distinctiveness, disproportionality, strategy, creativity, identity. If you think there's more to be discussed there, of course, we can discuss it. And I do go on to note the importance of interaction between othering and groupness. I'm not trying to create 2 separate pillars or disciplinary inquiries. One's into othering, one's into groups as they are. Because in fact, groups are constituted by othering and by their own subjectivity. And I do go on to say a little bit about that. But I won't do that now, as I just said to you, because of the time element. I want to turn to proposition 3, because I think, I got some points to make there that I'd like to share with you and see how you react to them. So I'm turning to critique of othering presupposes a normative framework which needs to be justified. And so far, sociologists might say, well, okay, we're with you in 1 and 2, but quite a lot of sociologists want to leave me on this point and say, oh, normative, not sure about that at all, but I hope I managed to persuade you a little bit. Othering nearly always identifies the group in question in terms of negative features. These can take many different forms. Some of the most common are to do with having lower intelligence, less capable of disciplined, responsible behavior, and with a propensity for criminal or violent behavior. Of course, we're all familiar with that. In relation to Muslims, some of the negative traits are an obsession with religion over other aspects of life, moral conservatism, especially in relation to sexuality, patriarchy, tendency to act on religion or politics in extreme and violent ways. And I take it we're all familiar with that as well. So as I've already said a couple of times and tried to strengthen, analysis of othering is clearly an important tool when it can be deployed to show the operation of these negative perceptions, in the media, in the news, in politics, and so on. So, that's really part of the first proposition. There is, however, a limitation to such analyses of othering or racialization, namely that sometimes there's a lack of agreement between those doing the othering and those being othered about whether certain features are necessarily negative. Most people will agree that to describe a group as less intelligent is to have said something negative about it. But is this the case with religious strictness and moral conservatism? Here it is possible that the dominant group may take one view of the matter, namely that such attitudes and behaviors are negative and backward, but the minority, that is to say substantial numbers within the minority, may refuse that such characterizations are negative. In recent years, we have seen this most starkly in Europe, in the dominant society's view that wearing the hijab, the headscarf, or the burqa by Muslim women is a sign of oppression. Despite the dominant society delivering this judgment through the popular and intellectual media, the numbers of women engaged in such practice has increased. And the increase has been accompanied by the women in question saying that they're choosing to don such clothes out of choice and not as compliance with the demands of Muslim men. To accept, to qualify, or to resist such Muslims' women's perspective is not just a matter of empirical inquiry, but invokes a normative framework. In recent years, aspects of feminism and liberalism, what might be called Western feminism or muscular liberalism, to use a term that a former prime minister of mine used, In recent years, these terms have been cynically and insincerely used to critique and undermine various Muslim practices and claims for accommodation, including issues of women's dress. However, not all such appeals have to be cynical or insincere. I mean, there are principled arguments in liberalism and feminism. It's not just because a feminist argument is deployed doesn't mean that it has to be insincere. They can be principled and reasonable. Without trying to spell out now, though I'll say a little bit more in my conclusion, without trying to spell out now in any detail the sincere and insincere versions of these highly complex and varied isms, I'm simply making the point that some such normative framework is necessary. An analysis of othering, for example, of how the fact of living within a hegemonic secularism subtly influences Muslim subjectivity, I'm thinking very much here of someone like Talal Asad, that argument, I'm saying is incomplete without an appeal to a normative framework, for without that, we cannot know to what extent the influence is a result of an exercise of self-interested power, of domination, and to what extent it is an aspect of benign social change on the part of Muslims themselves, who on a reasoned basis come to adapt their practices and modify their sense of what it means to be a Muslim. So just because Muslims change in a certain way doesn't mean they have been coerced into change. They may have chosen to change over a period of time. But how can we tell the difference between coercion and people changing under normal social conditions? I'm saying, well, we can't unless we have a normative framework which can tell us what is the difference between coercion and normal social change. Or if you like, reasonable or unreasonable pressures for change. To stick with my earlier example, to argue that the hijab or niqab or burqa are or are not a form of oppressive othering is not just a matter of empirical inquiry or discourse analysis, but implicitly or explicitly appeal to how to distinguish between what is negative and what is positive in the characterization of Muslims. If it is implicit, it needs to be made explicit. Either way, the normative presuppositions need to be questioned. That is to say, they cannot be taken for granted, but stand in need of argument and justification. Without such justification, not only may an analysis of othering be incomplete or distorted, but it may itself be an exercise in othering, namely in seeing groups in question as prejudicially othered as, for example, religious conservatives, when that is exactly how the group may wish to think of itself and to be respected for being as such. This will, of course, be an empirical matter, which, of course, takes us to Proposition 2, back to Proposition 2. Hence, my first point, that critique of othering presupposes empirical knowledge of the other. But depending on the facts, it may also be a refusal to accept the group on its own terms. That may not be wrong as such. My point is that to accept or not to accept will require a normative argument. So my argument isn't whatever Muslims say, oh, this is being a Muslim, everyone else just says, oh yeah, okay, that's fine, get on with it. No, that's not my argument at all. My argument is, if Muslims say, oh, we do this because we're Muslims, and one has an objection to that or wants to, in some sense, question that, one can't do it without a normative framework. That's my point. So, my point is that to accept or not to accept will require a normative argument, and so a perspective such as Orientalism or anti-Islamophobia are incomplete without normative argument. The kind of normative disavowal that one finds in the influential work of, say, Talal Asad is misplaced. he's been a powerful force for getting us to rethink secularism, but his conceptual framework does not explicitly help us to determine whether secularism is a good thing or which version of secularism is better than another. Or to put it another way, everyone will agree that Islamophobia must be distinguished from reasonable criticism of Muslims. So here's another one of my throwaway generalizations. Everyone will agree. Tell me if you don't agree. But I'm saying everyone will agree that Islamophobia must be distinguished from reasonable criticism of Muslims and aspects of Islam. But not only is this a difficult distinction to make, but it begs the question, what are reasonable criticisms that Muslims and non-Muslims may make or discuss in relation to some Muslim views about, say, gender or education or secularism? Not only must the study of Islamophobia not squeeze out the possibility of such discussion, but by showing us where it becomes Islamophobic, it should help to guide us onto the terrain of reasonable dialogue. Merely identifying the unreasonable and the populist is not enough. Our frames of analysis should lead us to the reasonable, to what criticisms may be made of Muslims and or Islam, and what criticisms that Muslims want to make of contemporary Western societies too are worthy of hearing. The minority in question must be able to negotiate, modify, accept criticism, and change in its own way, which means a dialogue must be distinguished from a one-sided imposition. Islamophobia should therefore be studied within a normative framework and not just one that exposes the normative presuppositions of others while evading the challenge of justifying one's own normative presuppositions. The framework I use is that of multiculturalism or a struggle for recognition and institutional accommodation, a normative framework which prioritizes groups fighting negative outsider perceptions by giving normative and political weight to insider identifications in all their plurality. Of course, I haven't said much about multiculturalism or recognition here. I didn't want to repeat what I've argued all too often elsewhere, but I'll conclude by addressing a question that I've been asked when I've given this talk elsewhere. I say that an analysis of Islamophobia must leave space for reasonable criticisms of Muslims or Islam. And people then say to me, yeah, but can you expand that a bit? So that's how I'll conclude, by expanding that a bit. So this is where we get to, here we go. How can we distinguish between Islamophobia and reasonable criticism of Muslims? And so here's an example, one that in a way I've already been referring to. Muslim views about women are oppressive and not appropriate for modern Britain. So the question is that statement an example for me of Islamophobia or reasonable criticism? Well, obviously, you wouldn't expect me to give a yes or no answer. So the answer I give is, it depends on 5 tests, and these are the 5 tests. Firstly, does it stereotype Muslims by assuming they all think the same? So that's the kind of othering I've talked about. Secondly, is it about Muslims, or is it a dialogue with Muslims which they would wish to join in? Some of you will know President Sarkozy, when he was president, said he initiated what he called a national dialogue about French national identity. The only question ever asked in that national debate was, is Islam compatible with being French or the French way of life and whatever? But Muslims didn't want that dialogue, or even if they did, they weren't invited to join in. It was about Muslims. So that really then becomes an Islamophobic characteristic, not a reasonable criticism, dialogue-based. Thirdly, is mutual learning possible? So I think that's important if we're talking about dialogue. And as you can see, the thread that runs through the 5 criticisms is very much the idea of dialogue, to distinguish it from othering. So with dialogue, we must be open to the possibility that there can be mutual learning. Otherwise, it's just all one way telling the other person why they're wrong and why they have to change. And I've got a couple of examples here of, our contemporary context, current context, in which some of the things that Muslims say might well be worth listening to. So Muslims often say about Western society that it's over-sexualized. It's highly sexualized. And it's interesting that this is something that is very much in our current way of thinking and present discussions and so on. Of course, very much to do with male power and initiated by no means confined to the conduct of Harvey Weinstein and so on. But here's something that perhaps some of the things Muslims might want to say about society and sexualization might be relevant. Perhaps their solutions might not be relevant, but their diagnosis might be pertinent. Muslims are always shocked by how they're brought up to respect older women, mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and so on. And yet older women in contemporary Western society are somehow seen as less worthy of attention and so on because they're no longer as good looking as they were and so on. Well, here's something that's a basis for a dialogue. Schooling. A lot of Muslims, by no means all, but a lot of Muslims want to see secondary schooling gender segregated. Well, it's interesting that now quite a lot of feminists say, the problem with a lot of schooling is these mixed classes where boys dominate the classroom, especially when science and maths is being taught and so on, and girls do perform better, and there is some empirical research to show that they do. Girls do perform better if they can do some subjects without boys, and actually boys perform worse. So there's an instrumental reason for having girls in the class if we want to improve boys' performances. So that's my third test. 2 remaining tests. So the first one, I haven't numbered it 4, but number 4 is the language civil and contextually appropriate? So I illustrate that because, of course, one can always make the same point in different language. I illustrate that by saying, think about how one could criticize the state of Israel, Israeli government policy, its military, its security service, and so on, especially what's happening at the moment on the border with Gaza. Now, there are some ways to do it that we might think, well, that's very anti-Semitic. But there are other ways to do it we think this is reasonable criticism. We may not even agree with some or all of it, but we would recognize that it is reasonable criticism. It would be mad to say that any criticism of Israel or Zionism is anti-Semitic by definition. My fifth, and so similarly with Islamophobia and criticism of Muslims. So my fifth and last point is insincere criticism, and that should be all ulterior motives, so the F in the middle shouldn't be there. Insincere criticism or ulterior motives. Well, again, this example about Israel serves a point because it'll be, I'm sure, apparent to everybody that many people who only some years ago were critics of Zionism have now become very big supporters of Zionism. The Christian right, the evangelical right, even where in some contexts some anti-Semitic discourses can be found amongst them, they've become very big supporters of the State of Israel. And in Europe, groups that, racist and fascist organizations in Britain and in Western Europe that used to be very anti-Semitic. Now on their demonstrations, they don't just carry the Union Jack and so on, they carry the flag of Israel and so on. Why? Obviously because they think it's a stick to beat Muslims with, for no other reason. So obviously that's then an example of Islamophobia, not of reasonable criticism. And I conclude by pointing to something which, again, I think is apparent, and I alluded to it in my talk just a little while ago in relation to Islamophobia, of how feminism has been instrumentalized and used in an Islamophobic way. Loads of people on the right who used to complain about angry feminists and lesbians who weren't worth looking at and so on, now have become champions of sexual equality and now say, in Britain, we're told that gender equality is one of the fundamental British values. And the only people who don't share it are Muslims. So that's not really a reasonable dialogue. So I hope those 5 tests are useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your talk. So I was thinking about, so the idea that you need Proposition 2.
Yeah, I thought it might be useful just to have this proposition.
So the idea that you have non-othered knowledge, which in a sense facilitates othering, like the project of othering, the project of racism or Islamophobia. So I do research on South Asian migration to Britain in the 20th century, and I'm looking at the 60s and the Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962, which in that form is kind of an othering for any so-called new Commonwealth citizen, right? Like, and if you link it up to nascent British nationalism or fascism in the early 60s, you get like a kind of general othering, right, of South Asians. Whereas moving into, I guess, the 70s and 80s and 90s, you get a far more specific form of Islamophobia in Britain, because perhaps there's this additional information. And my question, I guess, if you accept that, I don't know if you do, but I wonder to what extent the emergence of jihadism and fanaticism that informs Islamophobia in a way that in, say, the 20s and 30s, there was this kind of romanticization of the East and this traffic in Eastern artifacts for luxury spending and all that kind of thing. And perhaps, I'm speaking specifically, I guess, in Britain.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't really make the point that you said I made. So, because you started off by saying that I was arguing that for othering to be possible, i.e. for someone to be engaged in othering, whether it's an individual or a society or whatever, they have to have empirical knowledge about a group. My main point was that for us to know that othering is taking place, us being the analysts, for us to know that othering is taking place, we have to have some empirical knowledge about the group. So that's a different point. So racists could be absolutely ignorant about Muslims and come up with all kinds of stereotypes which are clearly forms of othering, but they may not be very effective stereotypes for very long, because supposing Muslims came up with the view that Muslims don't eat beef, and therefore they're somehow effeminate vegetarians. That stereotype would not be really a very effective stereotype, because a lot of Muslims actually enjoy meat. So in that sense, some empirical knowledge might be necessary for an effective stereotype. But that wasn't really my point. My point was the othering can be all kinds of distortion, though bound to have some empirical element in it. For us to simply understand and explain othering is not possible without some empirical knowledge of the group. Now, and of course, in one sense, to catch up with your historical story, othering has become more sophisticated because actually some racists and so on have learned stuff about Muslims that they didn't know in previous decades. So, their stereotypes are, if you like, prima facie more applicable and therefore perhaps possibly more effective. So I'm sorry I didn't entirely answer your question because you were asking me something that I wasn't quite making. But in general, I would say that a stereotype, an othering projection would have to have some empirical elements, but I'm not so concerned to argue that all that empirical element has to be accurate. Just stereotype wouldn't be very effective for very long if it wasn't. But I'm more concerned about how we, as analysts of Islamophobia, what is the logic of our inquiry? And I want to say the logic of our inquiry requires knowing something about the group that's being othered and a normative framework for studying aspects of social change in relation to that group. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Terry. I have, I guess, questions that may have more to do with the concepts that people are using in the American context to discuss some of these questions that you're interested in. So in American sociology, the concept of stigmatization is often used instead of the concept of othering. And the concept of racialization is used, but it's often as synonymous with racialization. So I kind of wanted to ask you to comment on these concepts. I think the concept of stigmatization typically refers to, a description of groups that are negatively connotated. So it's pretty simple. And then, so that's one question. Another question is your discussion of characteristics of groups in some ways reminded me of the work of Frederick Barth, because a lot of his work was precisely about the fact that there's no essence to groups or essence to culture, that we really need to look at groups through boundaries and look at how they define each other relationally. So basically that's the other question, and it's very much connected to the question of racialization. Is racialization, why use the term racialization if the groups themselves don't think of each other in racial terms, but in religious terms? So basically I'm asking you to provide us maybe a little bit of a reflection on how you understand the landscape against which these questions are asked in the British context, and maybe if you know enough about what's happening here, why do we use these terms of stigmatization instead of racialization?
Well, I don't know enough about what's happening in American society or in American social inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
On the whole, I would say that the people I read and engage with don't use stigmatization as an organizing concept. I mean, the word might appear in a few contexts and so on, but it's not what's doing all the work. But I can see that it may be used by others to do something very similar. I can certainly see that. In relation to Barth, yes, of course, and in the bit that I didn't read out and so on, I did refer to Barth. I, like a lot of people, am influenced by Barth and can see the sense in which he emphasized the importance of the continuity of a group. The fact that we might say the same groups existed from, the year 1900 to 1950 to 2000, what is it that we would say is the same, in order to say it's the same group? And he says, well, it can't be cultural content, because that can change over time and does. So it must be who is in the group and who is out of the group, and that this is a fluid thing. Boundaries move. Some people who were supposed to be outsiders can become insiders, or the group might fragment on the basis of, oh, we're the real Muslims, they're not the real Muslims, or, you know, we're the real X. I think that's very insightful and gives us, you know, points to studying certain dynamics which are very important. I do think that he probably overstates his case, because it's such a good case, by creating, or if he doesn't do it, let's say a lot of people who've been influenced by him have done it, by creating too much of a binary between cultural content and boundaries. Because if the argument is, well, cultural content changes over time, so cultural content can't define the group, well, yes, but his own argument says boundaries change over time as well. And there is a sense in which dissent is actually quite important, though of course it is perceived dissent or believed dissent, because not everybody has the historical facts to know who's descended from whom, whatever. But pointing to who your, you know, parents, grandparents, and ancestors were is a way that people identify themselves in ethnic group terms. But I think that people within a group also define themselves by, if you like, the arguments that they have, the controversies that they engage with. So, you know, there's a number of people who call themselves Muslim feminists. So they want to argue about what is said about women in the Quran, and above all, about how did the Prophet Muhammad treat women, and what did he say about women, and so on, because that's actually a very egalitarian corpus. And they say, oh, but all the interpreters, who were all men and so on, they took over, and they edited out or understated all those things, and so they want to rework that. Now, a lot of kind of what you might call some religious Muslim scholars want to dismiss these people and say, well, you're not really understanding the Quran and so on. They wouldn't go as far as to say you're not really a Muslim. I think they wouldn't say that, but they would question the status and the epistemology of such people as a way of, if not putting them outside the group, certainly pushing them away from the center to the periphery. So that's an example of group dynamics, which is an argument about who's at the center and who's at the periphery, rather than who's in and who's out. And in many ways, it's an argument about cultural content, i.e., what is an authoritative understanding of gender roles in Islam. So I think questions about authority, or to use a Charles Taylor term, authenticity, I think those are also important arguments, and not all of them are about saying, are you in or are you out? They can be about, you know, are you really at the center, or are you something lesser, more peripheral?
Thank you. This is really thought-provoking. I wanted to just ask you about this third proposition about the critique of othering in the normative framework. And I was thinking a lot about the 5 tests that you gave us, which I thought was very interesting. But I was thinking about a different way of thinking about this question, which is, you know, some of the work on like symbolic racism or racial resentment in the U.S. tries to answer this question by saying, looking at, and this is sort of a quantitative way of looking at this, is like survey data, right? So you ask people about their feelings about particular groups, right? So this has been done on, about blacks in the United States. So, attitudes about, say, racial inferiority. And then comparing that to, say, social policy attitudes about, in the old literature, it was like, should we have, say, affirmative action or busing, like enforced integration, these kinds of things. And this analysis, these analyses would say there's a correlation between negative attitudes about the group and anti-egalitarian attitudes, right? And so it was all about the I don't know how to call that group, the othering group, right? Or the racists, or the presumed racists, right? So to answer this question, like, is this a valid critique or not? You could look at, like, is there the person who is other, like the critic, is the critic someone who has these negative views about the group, rather than looking at starting with this normative framework? And I don't know how you think about that, or is that because it seems like, so anyway, so yeah.
I'm not entirely sure I've understood, but I've got an answer to a question which you may not have asked. And if it happens that you didn't ask that question, you'll have to tell me what exactly you did ask.
Yeah.
So I think there's good evidence, across a number of different countries and so on, that, for instance, negative views of minorities, or let's just say, racist views, are correlated with people who believe that current levels of immigration are too high, and that the government has lost control and needs to establish control. So one can say, well, look, one doesn't then need a normative framework. We've identified why people want immigration control. Well, I would say we haven't, because in a way, there is a kind of unstated normative work that's being done in that social science. Because, of course, the correlation depends on what questions you ask. So what if we also found out that there was a strong correlation between people who feel that the rate of change in their neighborhood and in their society, and even a kind of sense of country identity, a sense of who we are as a country and so on, that was changing too fast, and a correlation between that and wanting immigration control or reducing levels of immigration. Now, isn't there a normative distinction between those two views? So to have racist views correlated with wanting immigration control is a way of undermining the legitimacy of an argument. I mean, a politician might still say we've got to have immigration control because I need their votes and so on. That's just the real world we live in and so on. But normatively, that little piece of social science research that found a correlation has actually delegitimized the argument. But here's another piece of social science that asked a different question or different sets of questions, and now it's found a way of legitimizing the concern for immigration control, which isn't about being racist, it's about a sense of social stability and national identity. As, if you like, it's about identity anxiety. And identity anxiety is not necessarily racist. So the social scientist who goes for one research design and one who goes for another, they're making a normative decision about what to look for. So I think social scientists that don't look for both, let's put it that way, who don't look for both, are likely to have, as it were, unquestioned presuppositions about what's doing the work. Yeah. Sorry, did I answer the question you actually wanted to ask?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I want to build also on point 3 very differently, you know. And that might have to do with where we position a normative intervention. So I come from Canada, and you might hear from Quebec, where we're really in the midst of a lot of Islamophobia in the public sphere, but we're also in a moment, it's been going on for several years, where multiculturalism as a normative framework is also being rejected. And so listening to your point 3, I'm kind of, I'm in agreement with the general statement, but that leads me when it comes to action or even to argument as a social scientist, in kind of a bind, right? Because I do not have access to that resource, because building my critique of uttering on multiculturalism is absolutely impossible for me. Well, I would like it. It's kind of a second hurdle I would need to go through. So for somebody like me, and I think for a lot of other people in Europe as well, this is a really difficult position to take. So what would be your advice, and what would you argue in that case?
Yeah. Before I engage with that question, I got a little bit of a kind of footnote to the discussion with Natasha, because another way of kind of expressing what I was saying is, I do think that, you know, I mean, everyone's guilty of this, as it were, but in social science, we do sometimes assume ways of thinking in other people that we then go out to test. But we tend to assume that the negative logic is the real logic, the dominant logic. I mean, I'm not saying we do all this always, I'm just saying we do it sometimes and aren't aware that we do it. So I think the example I gave you, where someone, first social scientist says, oh, I want to see if immigration is being driven by racism. And the other social scientists would say, oh, I want to see if immigration is being being driven by a sense of kind of majoritarian identity anxiety. And they both find that there's a correlation. I mean, but they haven't, I mean, as I say, it's best to do both. But my criticism of the first one would be, we need to be a little bit more generous. At least this is my own personal approach. We need to be a little bit more generous in identifying the reasoning of others. So we need to try and think of, well, what might be the good reasons or the best reasons? Now, sometimes that may lead to forms of naivety, but I think it's better to err on the side of generosity. So, you know, and now this could be a segue to your question. There's, you know, so many different critiques of multiculturalism from all different directions, or perhaps the same critiques voiced from so many different directions. And I try and engage with them, and I try and find the best way of stating a critique and then responding to it. And a lot of my sort of colleagues and co-authors, they say, but Tariq, why? It's obvious that this is an incoherent piece of twaddle. Why are you giving it the time of day? And I just feel, well, there may be something in the criticism that we could all learn from. So I always try to bring out what is the best argument for something that you disagree with, and then you try and, you know, if you like, destroy the argument. But there's no point knocking down bad reasons. So what's the best reason for something that you disagree with, and then see to what extent you've got an argument against it. So as I say, that does perhaps lead to a certain kind of political innocence at times. And maybe that's why I carry on arguing for multiculturalism, even if no one's listening. And you say, you know, you're a bit more of a realist, so you don't want to waste your time arguing for something that no one is going to pay any attention to.
It's not even that they don't pay attention to, it's that they close up,
Yeah.
like oysters. Right? Just, well,
Yeah. Well, of course, I was making my argument in terms of social science inquiry. And you may say that how the argument then has to be presented in a public debate might take a different form. I can certainly see the sense of that. I mean, you know, different contexts do require different kind of registers of argument. But I guess I'm not quite so pessimistic about the prospects for multiculturalism. The term itself is very, very heavily damaged. So, yeah, I guess if you were talking to a politician in Europe or perhaps most other places, and you said, oh, I've come to put forward a multiculturalist argument, they're likely to stop listening to you or think, oh, stop wasting my time. But think about it for a moment. We've now had something like, you know, between 15 and 20 years where that there's a consensus that multiculturalism is dead, or multiculturalism is served its purpose and out of date. But what have we got instead? I mean, if it was so clear that we'd identified something that was kind of totally wrong and useless and incoherent, how is it that we haven't managed to come up with something better? Moreover, when I listen to criticisms about multiculturalism from people who say they're being, you know, realistic and not naive like myself, they say things like, oh, well, multiculturalism leads to segregation. Multiculturalism leads to high levels of youth crime in ethnic minority communities. Because people stand out as different and as assertively different, they're likely to be discriminated against and so on. So, you know, you can imagine all these tirades of things that people say. That's why multiculturalism is the wrong approach. And I say, well, my goodness, you've just described a place like France. And the French proudly insist that they've never had any multiculturalism. So what is it that France has achieved that countries that have dabbled in multiculturalism, let us say like Britain, you know, we don't have to even bring in an exemplar like Canada, but a more midway house country like Britain. What is it that France has achieved that Britain has failed to achieve because of its multiculturalism? So I find that if we're not talking about intellectual argument, but just like social ills, you know, policy failures, that the so-called policy failures of multiculturalism are to be found in a greater measure in countries like France and Germany, who say they're anti-multiculturalists, than in Britain. So, as I say, I'm not quite as pessimistic as you. I feel that in one form or another, we all can see that our societies are going to become more diverse than they're today, not less. And that group identities, group consciousness, both this negative and the positive aspect of group consciousness, both the othering, but also people's own sense of group identity, is not going away. It's hardening. For a lot of people, for some people, it's perhaps not hardening. It's becoming more fluid, and, you know, multiple identities are becoming more possible for them, and so on. So given, if that's my diagnosis of what our social condition is and is likely to continue to be, then we're going to need something like multiculturalism, and if someone can't come up with an alternative, then I feel, I can't be talking complete nonsense. Yes? Oh, right, sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I just had two clarification questions.
I think might sound naive, but would possibly veil some of the tensions that I think necessitate further investigation. So about your third point, critique of authoring presupposes a normative framework. My question would be about what? Especially, is it about the authoring itself or the piece we contextualize it in? In other words, is it a normative framework about Islamophobia, or is it a normative framework about democracy? When we ask the question, is Islam compatible with democracy? It might be the latter, in which case the critique of the othering itself might not necessarily presuppose a normative framework theoretically. It's when we impose it to contextualizing in a different kind of more less academic but more public policy oriented conversation that we actually necessitate a normative framework. So I was just wondering for the first question if you could kind of clarify the subject matter, or I think the subject of the normative framework. And then the second question is that, could you clarify a bit more how you would define Islamophobia in the first place? Because I think even before doing the 5 steps that we do, depending on how academically or intellectually we define and draw the boundaries of what Islamophobia is, I think the results of the test would become very different. And the reason why I'm asking that question is that, for example, when we study crime or deviance, right, there's obviously a certain normative idea that we should not commit a crime, right, that we should not deviate from the collective consciousness of laws, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the study of crime necessitates a normative framework. That's the personal kind of citizen hat that we're putting on as opposed to the academic intellectual hat. So contextualizing that in those terms, I was just wondering whether you could speak to those 2 points.
Right, thank you. So the normative framework that I was referring to is what I think is the framework for study. Now, democracy could be exactly that framework, and I think for some people it is. For a lot of other people, it's equality. And of course, the framework that I work with and have been working with for a long time, but didn't say much about here, is what I call multiculturalism, which is similar to and different to, of course, what other people might argue for, and a central feature of which is this idea of recognition, which I borrow from Charles Taylor, recognition and misrecognition. And I want to, and I have used it, I think, people say reasonably plausibly, as a framework for explaining what's happening in the world, not just a framework for judging people or evaluating policies and so on. So if we take something like the controversy over the novel, The Satanic Verses, are you aware of that case? Yeah. So a lot of people thought, my God, what's happening? Surely people can't get angry about a book. Other people saw it in fairly narrow, what one might call theological terms. And, just like, oh, this is a blasphemy, and here are people who are angry about blasphemy. I felt that those kinds of explanations, and especially ones that were very dismissive of Muslim arguments, not that, everything that Muslims did was acceptable, and obviously, for me personally, unacceptable, threatening the life of an author and so on for what they've written. But those dismissive views that said, oh, Muslims don't understand novels, that they're just an intolerant bunch of people, they don't share the values of the Enlightenment and so on, I felt those were all inadequate frameworks for understanding that situation, for understanding, if you like, Muslim anger. But something like the idea of recognition and misrecognition worked much better, because up to that time, and I know some of you, are scholars of British society, so up to about that time, the people who were most concerned with racial equality, or many of them, had thought that the best way of framing the issues around inequality and equality was to see everything in terms of a color racism. And so a dynamic concept of political blackness, meaning embracing everybody who wasn't white, would be one way of bringing people together who could then campaign for, mobilize for equality, but also the institutions of British society would be able to better identify what the problem was in their current processes and so on. So the Satanic Verses Affair was one of the first, if not the very first, that showed that that framework was not a very good framework for understanding minorities and minority-majority relations in Britain, because at no point did Muslims, who were obviously creating quite a stir, and were genuinely angry, at no point did they refer to anything to do with political blackness, and nor did other minorities come to express any support for Muslims. The only people who offered any support for Muslims were some Christians, because they said, we understand how you feel. Or we don't fully share your views, but let's talk about it because we are sympathetic. So I would say that the concept of recognition and misrecognition and the struggle for recognition then offers you a framework for understanding that controversy, but also understanding various kinds of conflicts and controversies happening in British society around majority-minority relations. So that's what I mean by a normative framework, because recognition is quite clearly a normative concept. I mean, so is equality, but there is a way that you can just try and, as it were, take the normative out of equality by turning it into a numerical thing. So it's, you have equality where everybody gets the same jobs in the same proportion of their demography and so on, which is still a normative concept, but you could prima facie say, a social scientist could say, all I'm doing is measuring. I don't have any views of my own on this. All I'm doing is measuring. Whereas with recognition, you couldn't really say that. You could say, I'm borrowing a normative concept and then trying to operationalize it. You could try and do that, but and you may say, I don't even share this normative concept myself. I just want to do this as a piece of research. I guess that would be possible, but you'd have to recognize that it was a normative concept that you were trying to operationalize. So that's what I mean by having a normative framework. And I've got one that I want to advocate for, but I recognize that for other people, democracy or equality or human rights or cosmopolitanism, there are a number of frameworks that vie with each other or sometimes hybridize with each other. In relation to your question about defining Islamophobia, in a way I'm a bit disappointed that you should ask me this question, because in a way my first proposition is trying to define Islamophobia in terms of racialization and specifically cultural racism of Muslims as an ethno-religious group. What is the bit more that you think, I need to say a bit more in order to get that definition?
Yeah, I think it was more thinking of terms of measuring that and or empirically kind of identifying that and analyzing it for an empirical study, for example. So I totally understand the fact that you're contextualizing within this intellectual framework, but I was thinking that before trying to differentiate, in order to differentiate Islamophobia from criticisms of Islam, I think there needs to be kind of a definitional formulation of how we would track that.
Yeah, okay. I would say that's a different level of definition then to the level of definition I was offering. Because if you remember, I started off by referring to the Runnymede Trusts Islamophobia report 1997, they and some other people, not just them, they and some other people tended to take or suggest it be legitimate to take the inquiry in the direction of what we might call a theological discussion. Like, what is Islam really? And therefore, that Islamophobia is someone who has some problem with some doctrines within Islam. But most people who are Islamophobic, certainly in Europe, actually don't come from that kind of position. And they tend to be quite strongly secularist, so it's not like that they're mainly Christians. I'm working at kind of that level of framework rather than, oh, well, how will we operationalize this for a specific, in particular, if we're thinking about a quantitative piece of research. I'm trying to, my focus is we should focus on Muslims rather than Islamic doctrines, and we should focus on the othering of Muslims, and then, as it were, the other propositions follow. So that's the kind of definition I'm offering, but it's at a, if you like, at a more generic level, at a higher level of abstraction than the definition that would help one to design a piece of research.
So I think we should stop here and give you a break, take a breather. But please join me in thanking Chuck for